Hello BookTube, it's Roz and I'm here to do a scallydandling video, and those are the ones when I talk about books that I've read that are from places other than the UK where I'm from, so a bit of a venturing off in different directions. And I've got two today that are kind of contrasting books, I suppose, although they're from neighbouring countries. So one is Why Goats Smell Bad, by Raouf Mama from Benin, and the other, which is on the Kindle so I can't show you a picture, is My Sister the Serial Killer by the Nigerian author Oyinkan Braithwaite. Let's locate ourselves if we're not from either Benin or Nigeria. Okay, so they're both countries in West Africa, and they're on the Gulf of Guinea, or the area that historically was known as the Slave Coast, because it was the area from which so many people were taken in slavery to the West Indies and Americas and so on. So yeah, that kind of where Africa kind of bulges out there in that bit there. Benin is quite a small place. It's like one of those little thin narrow countries like Togo, and there's a few there that shape, and so population about 11.5 million, so really, small. And it used to be known as Dahomey, and I mention that because that reminds us that it was the kind of centre of the Dahomey Empire in the Kingdom of Dahomey from the sort of 17th to the 19th century. Quite very interesting if you're into kind of West African history. Quite militaristic, very successful kind of kingdom. Yeah. The official language in Benin is French, because it was a French colony, but the largest language otherwise is Fon, and that's kind of Raouf Mama was a Fon speaker originally. Nigeria, right next door, very different. Geographically much bigger, but also just enormously more populous place. I think that the population there is around 200 million currently, so one of the biggest in the world. Has the largest economy in Africa. It has oil, is a key difference, I guess, yeah, big oil. Very multicultural country, it's like a country that's got lots of different kind of cultures within it, lots of different languages, but English is almost like a unifying language, official language, because it was an English colony. So two quite different places, although bang next door to each other. Now, you will know that I'm on a bit of a mission to read a book by an author that comes from every country in the world, and finding something in English by an author from Benin is not straightforward. Now, it's not that Benin doesn't have a sort of literary tradition. I think the first novel to be published by an author from Benin was Felix Couchoro in 1929. His book The Slave, what is love, but basically everything is in French, and virtually nothing translated into English. I would have liked to have read Snares Without End by Olympe Bhely-Quenum, which was written in 1960 and translated into English, published in 1981, but it's now out of print, can't get hold of it, or if you can, it's like 200 quid, so not realistic for me. I'm therefore very grateful to Raouf Mama, who grew up in Benin but is now a professor of English in Connecticut in the States, and he's taken it on himself to capture the incredible oral storytelling tradition of the Fon people in particular from Benin, and make that available to the English speaking world. And it's a very, that's his very deliberate goal. He's a storyteller, and he sort of goes round the States and the world, sort of telling these stories, because he feels that they're really important, and I'm right with him on that. And he's written a few books, but the one I read was Why Goats Smell Bad, which was published in 1998. And what he did was he took, wrote down stories that were being told orally by fond storytellers, and then translated them into English and put together a collection, and with some really, for me, coming to this, some really helpful kind of explanation, context, introduction. It's a really, the stories are great, but also he gives you a bit more, I suppose, in helping you understand sort of how they fit in fond culture. It's always really interesting reading books of folk tales from around the world, because one of the things you discover is that the same kind of, there's almost like archetypal stories that come up again and again. Like stories about orphans are a regular feature, and I suppose that makes sense, that we use folk tales as human beings to kind of make sense of aspects of human life, and until the sort of average life expectancy really increases, then being an orphan or being a step parent and an orphan was a kind of a key kind of difficult experience that then stories can explore. So this book has a kind of a Cinderella story, and it feels like almost any collection of folk tales I've read has like a Cinderella type story in it. Another kind of classic thing that you get in folk tales is origin or explanation stories, and there's a batch of those. Well, you can tell Why Goats Smell Bad, the title is, it's like the kind of story that Kipling created in the Just So stories, which are just sublime. But that was obviously inspired by the fact that they come up in so many traditions. The trickster, that's another recurring kind of character, I suppose, in folk tales, isn't it? Like Anansi, or the fox in Aesop, or whatever. And it's in these stories. It's now let me get the name right. Yogbar the glutton is the trickster in these stories. Great, they're always really enjoyable, great fun. Those stories. One of the other things that you get from folk tales, and I think Mama really sort of draws that out in these, is they tell you something about cultural values of the people that are telling those stories. So generosity, hospitality, come out as really strong in these stories. And there's a couple of stories in here that remind me of like the sort of European folktale that you get of where like the good character, I think she goes down a well and comes back covered in gold. So the bad character decides to do the same, and what they don't realise is they can follow the same steps that the good character did, but if they don't do it in a good-hearted, generous, polite and caring way, that the outcome will be different. So they come back up through the well tarred and feathered. Well, there's a very similar kind of story here. And you also get, I suppose, some of the environment and the sort of artifacts and what's important, what's used and important in that culture. So the drum is a big one in Why Goats Smell Bad. The role of the forest in stories is interesting, isn't it? Because in European stories, going into the woods is dangerous and you have to watch out for wolves, whether literal or metaphorical. Whereas in this book, the forest or the jungle is like a place of riches and generosity, a place where you can kind of make your fortune or yeah, so really that was really different and intriguing. Lovely stories, very enjoyable to read. It's not great literature, you know, nor is the other book I'm going to talk about, but it's charming, it's interesting. I learned something about myself, as you always do when you read books, and I learnt something about Benin, I guess. My only grumble, and is that Mama owns up to tidying up some of the stories a bit, or making kind of like neater and more meaningful endings to some of the stories, and I kind of wish I hadn't. I'd rather had them in the raw, but in doing that he's in a kind of great tradition, I suppose, of doing that with storytellers. Like I remember as a child reading a kind of a more original version of Cinderella, in which the her two stepsisters, when they're trying to fit their feet into her shoes, they actually cut their own toes off to try and do that, or their mother bullies them into doing that, you know. And so yeah, the sort of making stories a bit nicer and neater is, you know, I shouldn't really criticise him for that, because it's something that sort of, yeah, is a common practice, isn't it? So a lovely book, but probably one you're only going to want to read if you really want to read a book from Benin, or if you've got a kind of interest and enthusiasm for folk tales. The other book I read from Nigeria, I suppose you're kind of spoilt for choice, basically, in finding books in English to read from Nigeria. I mean, there's an obvious reason for that, you know, English is, you know, the official language for Nigeria, so lots and lots of books are written in English. So then, you know, we're not having to wait for something. You know, I'm looking forward to the day when I can read a contemporary novel by an author from Benin that's been translated into English, you know, and you know, when I hear of one, I will. With Nigeria, it's not an issue, because lots and lots are written in English, and but also there is a very strong literary sort of tradition of novel writing in Nigeria, and yeah, literary tradition generally. Nigeria had the first like Black African Nobel laureate, Wole Soyinka. Chinua Achebe, you know, the classic Nigerian author that I hope you've heard of, and if you haven't, you should have done. I can't be the only person who reading Things Fall Apart by him that he wrote in 1958 was like a kind of an epiphany moment for me about yeah, reading literature from sort of outside the, I don't know, standard Euro come American centric literary traditions that I grew up reading. So yeah, there's that depth, and then there's just loads of really internationally successful Nigerian authors now, aren't there? Ben Okri, that'd be one. Who's the woman that I love? Chimanda and Ngozi Adichie, yeah, that's her. Oh, Half of a Yellow Sun, Purple Hibiscus, you know, yeah, if you haven't read any books by her, I would say turn off whatever device you're watching this on and go and get one of her books and read that instead. Yeah, I love them. So, much more choice. I've read lots of books by Nigerian authors. This one was a debut novel by Oyinkan Braithwaite, My Sister the Serial Killer, and she was born in Lagos, then was partly educated in England, then went kind of back and forth, but basically settled again in Lagos in 2012, and this is her, as I say, her first novel, and if this is her first novel, I'm definitely interested in reading more by this author. Now, But what is interesting, and I suppose she's kind of like freed up by the quantity of Nigerian literature that there is now, to not feel she doesn't need to do what Raouf Mama needs to do of trying to share their culture or kind of represent their country's traditions, you know. And she says this. I'm going to read from an interview with her at the end of the book. She says, I wouldn't want to write a novel and people feel I'm speaking to a Nigerian experience. I'm speaking to my experience, to the things I'm interested in, and that's all I can do. And she does kind of recognise that there is still a bit of a pressure for African writers to speak for a whole continent or to speak for their particular country. But yeah, she doesn't feel that she had to do that. She says Africans are hungry for different types of stories. Within our own community, people are hungry for something else, for something different. They want more crime, they want more fantasy, they want more sci-fi or whatever. Things are already becoming more diverse, but it's going to become ridiculous. There's going to be a lot more. Absolutely. So she has written the book, you know, just a book that she wanted to write about, things that she wanted to write about, and I think she had a lot of fun writing this book, and then that really comes over to the reader. So it came out in 2018. It's very funny, it's very dark, it's very assured for a debut novel, and the device, the inspiration is, how does a respectable nurse working in Lagos cope with a sister who has the worrying habit of killing off her boyfriends one after the other? Yeah, how do you deal with that? It's about sisterly loyalty, I guess. It's about families. It has kind of a darker themes, I suppose, about the impact of childhood parental abuse on children that kind of stays with them into adulthood. Again, it's not great literature. It's not kind of setting out to be, if you know what I mean. It was a surprise, actually, that it was longlisted for the Booker and shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, because it's a crime novel. It's a crime novel. It's a great, really enjoyable crime novel with a nice twist to it and good dialogue and, yeah, excellent plot, real page turner, and you know, I'm a fan of that. That's great with me. It's smart, you know. I think, and I suppose almost the irony is that for a non-Nigerian reader, it also like immerses you in a kind of middle class life in Lagos. You know, I actually like learn lots about, you know, what it's like to live and work and have relationships, you know, in that bit of Nigerian society. So it did also fulfil my kind of scallydandling criteria of a successful book for me is one that takes me somewhere outside my own experience, and but it's also like just a great fun book to read. So that was this month's Scallydandle. See you all soon.